Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the journalist Alyssa Hardy. She has worked as the fashion news editor at Teen Vogue and the senior news editor at In Style. She is the author of the book, Worn Out: How Our Clothes Cover Up Fashion's Sins, available from the New Press. Alyssa Hardy, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to start with, before we get to the sins of the fashion industry, the fact that you are not, as I am not, anti-fashion.
No.
Right? You think that fashion could be a positive, a good force in the world. You like clothes. You like people who like clothes. It's okay to like clothes. Is that right?
That is extremely right.
Okay.
I, in fact, love fashion.
Yeah, because you can feel very guilty when you start to find out about all this stuff, right?
Sure. And I think, there is a level of, the guilt is okay a little bit too. You can recognize the sort of downsides of fashion while understanding that it's like one of the greatest joys that we have as humans.
But I also feel like one thing that I got from reading your book was that we should also think about the ways in which we love clothes and what it is we love about them. Mm-hmm. Because, you can love fashion or style while also recognizing that some of the things that we think we see in clothes might be manufactured, right? Like the sense of something, going out of style after a very short period of time.
Sure. Yeah, fashion is a business at the end of the day, right? And so trends and the cycles in which trends appear are part of the business of fashion and keeping people buying and keeping you feeling like you need something more. Because, if we all just said, okay, this is my 10 pieces of clothing, which we should be doing, and we're wearing these all the time, then these brands would have nothing to sell us. And so at the end of the day, of course, these trends are part of like our evolving culture, but the way that they're moving so fast, so quickly, the reason that you can walk into, whatever store at the mall or wherever it is, go onto your favorite store online and see a new set of clothing once a week is because they need to sell you more clothes to make money.
Mm-hmm. There was a phrase I read in your book that I'd never heard before, but is an industry phrase, microseasons, which I found very disturbing. What is a microseason?
So essentially a microseason is a shift that happens pretty much every week now at this point, but with brands like Shein, it's every single day. But essentially, as these brands start to put clothing out and they realize, okay, our customer likes this pattern, but they're not necessarily buying it in a short sleeve, they'll do another quick run, and it's going to be a long sleeve or a tank top, whatever that looks like. So every single week, these brands are putting out new styles and new runs of clothing, and it changes based on the slightest shift in what people are interested in.
And you describe a lot of your own experiences with clothes and with the industry over the course of your life. And you describe at one point that the kind of feeling that you can get of looking in your closet and thinking, oh no, I don't have anything that's new. All of this stuff is so old. And this, I think you even describe it as, you'd say everything was too outdated or not cool enough. And that was when the panic would kick in. So you can even have like a sense of panic of not having something that is new enough. And then it's strange to sort of realize that sense of panic has been kind of manufactured on purpose.
Sure. I think I think a lot of people, most people can kind of relate to this, even if it's not as dramatic as I'm being with like the panic of not having something to wear.
Sure.
But I think, just going in, and we all have this like inherent need to fit into something, whether or not we can push past it. Like, if you're going to a wedding or if you're going to a party or wherever that is, or just going into work, sometimes you go, okay, what is the perfect thing I need to be so that I can convey whatever it is I'm trying to convey? And you see new trends coming up on your social media. You're seeing brands push out TikTok videos or whatever that is. And you look in your closet and say, wait, I don't fit that. I don't have that. I need that. And it's all manufactured to get that sort of fight or flight response from us to be like, I need something new.
Yeah. So we have to love clothes while resisting that terrible fear of our clothes looking terrible. And we...
Yeah. Because we have too many. You definitely already have something in your closet. And the way that these clothing is manufactured is such a humongous issue. And the amount of clothing that is being manufactured is a huge issue. And so as we kind of buy into these trends, it allows for this cycle to just keep going and going and going.
You do document just how, when you say we have a lot of clothes, you mean it. I mean, and especially in the United States and Europe, in the West, you have an extraordinary statistic saying that I think it's 85% of clothes are discarded, and the millions and millions of it. And you sort of trace where our clothes end up, where they begin, the brief period that they're on our bodies, and then where they end up.
Yeah. And I think it has a lot to do with, it's a couple of different things, right? That trend cycle is certainly part of it and us growing out of the clothes that we're buying, but it's also just the quality of clothes. As these brands start to manufacture things at higher rates, the quality of clothing is going down. And so you're wearing something one or two times, and then you're either tossing it, hopefully you're not tossing it in a landfill, but it happens a lot. Or, even if you're tossing it in a donation bin, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be used for charity. These clothing piles end up all around the world in landfills, in deserts in Chile, or they end up in secondhand markets in Ghana, which, these markets are so overrun with the amount of clothing, and they don't know what's actually coming into these bales. So it's not necessarily like they can resell them. It's not necessarily like a good economic, there's not a lot of value for them in these bundles of clothing, but then they just have to deal with them.
Yeah. It is in many ways just hugely wasteful and absurd. I mean, you also discuss climate change in your book. I mean, we know at this point that being wasteful is not just like a matter of, well, we believe in efficiency for its own sake. It's also that when you're going through huge piles of resources and using intensive production processes, you're actually destroying the future of a livable planet.
Yeah. And fashion's climate impact is pretty whole. Like, it just starts from the beginning with where textiles are made on the farms. Like, cotton uses a ton of water. It doesn't necessarily need to, but the way that it's currently produced, it's using a lot of water. And then, within the manufacturing, there are so many toxic processes that dies, just generally like the energy that's being used in manufacturing. And then, of course, when it's in a landfill, all the plastics, the polyesters are kind of going off into the water. So it's kind of like full circle terrible for the environment.
The subtitle of your book is How Our Clothes Cover Up Fashion's Sins. And, throughout what you were emphasizing is the wide gap between what we see and what actually exists. The fact that we see the clothes, but all we see are the clothes. We don't see the vast supply chain network that leads to the clothes. We don't see, especially, the workers who produce the clothes, who are really kind of at the heart of this book and your journalism.
Yeah, I think the one thing that it's understandable in a way that it's not at the forefront because of just this type of society we live in. We are just taught to kind of just consume without really asking many questions. And so I think the one thing that the fashion industry does so uniquely is because it is so glamorous, it's so built on individualism and how this piece is going to work for me in my life right now. It's so easy to kind of set aside all of the things that go in making of that piece. And just like as an example, one pair of sneakers, just to get that pair of sneakers into the box, into the store, maybe 200 people had to touch it at some point. Whether that's, from the manufacturing, but also the farms, like the cotton and the rubber that's going into the sneakers. So many people are part of this clothing system, literally millions, mostly women throughout the world. And so the sort of like beauty fun side of fashion is amazing, and it's why it's so special, but it's also the reason why it's been so easy to cover up the true atrocities that happen throughout the fashion industry.
Mm-hmm. There's a real irony. You have this, you just mentioned that most people in the industry are women. You have a quote from your book: "We see fashion as a place where women are empowered, but it is only certain women." And there's sort of an irony that this is an industry in which women have always been leaders and able to do well, but it's also one of the industries that most exploits and preys upon women.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, and both are true, right? Like, I think fashion is weaponized against women often. Of course, we see people talking about what women are wearing in all sorts of settings, and it's used against them. But it's also, a way for women to take their own power back. And we see women as part of the industry on a larger level, whether that's like celebrities or executives. And you see this as this is a very cool job and a big women run industry, but it's really not. A lot of the executives are actually men. And then a lot of the women that are working are paid sometimes as little as 1 penny per item of clothing that they're making, which, is unlivable. They can't feed their families. And it's happening behind closed doors. It's happening with the brands that are putting out the marketing campaign saying, we are empowering women and putting on International Women's Day, go girls. And then they're not paying their mostly women workforce making the clothes.
Mm-hmm. It struck me reading your book. You talk about the anti-sweatshop movement of the early 2000s, which gained a lot of prominence, forced some industry concessions. And I don't hear about the sweatshop movement much anymore. I assume, however, this is not because we established ethical conditions in the garment industry around the world.
No, it's true. It exists, especially more on the worker level. What's been really interesting to see in the last couple of years, especially since the pandemic, is that workers have had a sort of level of empowerment in terms of striking, in terms of just putting together, in the US specifically, the worker advocacy movement toward getting these laws passed has been huge in the last 3 years. But for example, what happened in the early 2000s and the 90s was that a lot of these rules had so many loopholes because there wasn't liability. The brands were not responsible for the issues that were happening in the factories. And so therefore they could just say, oh, well, we didn't know. We didn't know. They could always hide because, the supply chain in fashion is extraordinarily complicated. There is a lot of subcontracting that happens. And so often what happens is a factory will be, maybe they look great, but then they subcontract to another factory that is not great. And the brand can say, well, we didn't know because we worked with this factory. We didn't know that factory was happening. So it's a very easy sort of scapegoat. And so some of the workers have done advocacy work in the last 2 years to sort of change that and make it so that the brands have a little bit more responsibility.
Yeah, because they make sure they don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's also possible for companies to brand themselves as ethical, make it a real selling point that they don't use sweatshop labor, and then have all sorts of other problematic aspects. I'm thinking, of course, of American Apparel, which you describe extensively in the book, which pitched itself as an ethical corporation and then turned out to be a den of sexual harassment and misogyny.
Yeah, sure. And I think because fashion is so complicated and because there's so many different elements to everything, obviously things are going to happen within most brands, but in order for fashion to make money, it has to grow quickly. And a lot of these brands sacrifice the well-being of their workers, the well-being of even their brand name in order to just grow rapidly and fast so that they can make as much money as possible and get it back to their investors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just see it constantly.
Mm-hmm. Something very, very ugly about, some of that, the incentives that capitalism produces in the clothing industry. Clothing should be something that is fun, that we can enjoy. It should be, we all need clothes. We should be able to produce the things that we need to cover ourselves up and look good in an ethical way.
Yeah.
But you just have on both sides of it, the exploitation on the production side, and then in the marketing side, generating these terrible insecurities in people and making them think that they need, they have to solve these manufactured insecurities through buying.
Exactly. That's how they make their money. Mm-hmm. It's truly it's a complicated problem that was made so easily just based off of our own instincts.
I want to talk a little bit about fashion journalism, because you have worked in fashion journalism. And I watched the documentary, the September issue about Vogue, and one of the things that struck me when I watched that is I was like, oh, this is interesting because they write about fashion, but there seem to be like no ethical standards mandating a separation between the companies and the people writing about the companies. Like, you know, Anna Wintour is having like meetings with the designers, and they're like just collaborating on what's going to go in the magazine, and you're like, well, in journalism, you have to have like a separation because there's like a conflict of interest. But that sense of a conflict of interest doesn't so much exist as far as I understand, because you write a bit about that, this from the inside.
Yeah. So it's something that I really like to talk about because, again, not to be like, oh, fashion is this unicorn, but sometimes fashion does just really play by its own rules, beauty as well. But like, I think specifically in the magazine space in fashion, like there really is a fine line between brand relationships and what you're writing about. Like that's kind of how the business was built of fashion magazines. And so I think as someone who is doing the reporting myself, I have had to struggle with the idea that like this brand works with the magazine. And this brand is also somebody that I need to report on what's happening. And so it is not that kind of like discerning eye is not innate in fashion magazines. But I do feel like the more that it is being talked about, the more the sort of up and coming journalists and even ones that have been around are able to kind of separate the way that they talk about the brands that are advertising with the magazine and the ones that they're actually just writing about from a story perspective. But yeah, it's not the same like a traditional newspaper. It just isn't because of the way advertising works in that space.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the book that there are these arrangements whereby the publication will get a certain percentage from the sales that come from, if you run an article that says, you know, the top big clothes, you know, the top whatever is at Amazon right now, you know, there will be these arrangements that specifically tie the company doing well to the publication doing well.
Sure, 100%. And so, and I think, and now they have to disclose it. I mean, and this is throughout any
tiny text.
Yeah. Well, throughout any industry too. Like if I was writing about like tech gadgets, it would be the same. But like, I think that because it's so embedded into the types of fashion stories, like it's, you know, this person is wearing a mini skirt. And so like buy the mini skirt on Amazon and, you know, this magazine will get 3% of the sale commission on it. That is such a huge revenue stream for not only just magazines, but like, you know, it's blogs and all of the influencers. Like that is a big way of the way they're making their money. And so it's very hard to separate criticism and how you're going to pay the bills.
Must have been an interesting experience working at Teen Vogue, because they're kind of a fascinating publication in that, you know, obviously the offspring of the actual Vogue, you know, the heart of the industry. But also, there's some people, there's some commentary that been coming out of Teen Vogue in recent years that can only be described as like radical left or Marxist. And it seems like a lot of the kind of young journalists who are pretty critical of the industry work there at the same time as the publication is kind of dependent on the industry. So what was that like?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, my experience with Teen Vogue, and just for full disclosure, I still work for them on a contract level, but I freelance still. But I think the thing about writing for and with young people is that they care so much. And so for me, as just a regular old fashion editor, it was seeing the ways in which young people were engaging with fashion and starting to understand the manufacturing side and starting to understand the labor side and caring about labor in everything. And so that is kind of how I kind of got the confidence to start writing about the labor side of fashion at a fashion magazine, because the audience was young and hungry for it. And so it was like the perfect place to be able to do that, especially because, you know, on the politics side and on, you know, the sort of other culture sides of the magazine, that was already starting to kind of happen a little bit more, especially, you know, with the 2016 election, things changed a lot with the way young people were kind of engaging with content. And so it made it very easy to do that. And I think that also those values lend themselves to what the movement for a more ethical fashion industry is, right? Like if workers throughout the fashion industry were paid more, clothing wouldn't be so cheap and it wouldn't be manufactured as much. Right. So like those values of fair labor are one of the top ways that we can change fashion and like that's young people care about that. And so just being able to kind of articulate it in the fashion context kind of was like a no-brainer.
Well, that's a positive change, because I feel like there was a time when it was just sort of don't talk about the sweatshops consensus.
Sure. 100%. And that's kind of like, when we talk about the movement in the 90s too, what I think is so interesting about that, again, it was young college students who were protesting Nike and kind of doing sit-ins in their athletic departments. It was Rage Against the Machine who was doing a music video about, sweatshops and using kind of like allusions to Gap alluding to Gap, sorry. And I think that it's kind of always been there. It's always been part of like the youth movement toward justice. It's uniquely positioned to be able to talk about this. And it is how I got started talking about it. My first story in this was at Teen Vogue.
I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that your book is not in any way anti-fashion, although it is scathingly critical of the labor practices in the industry, and rightly so. But nor is your book merely long expose of all the terrible things that are happening, because you point out, in many ways, it's very inspiring stories of people who see these things, going back to the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, people who have seen injustices, who have determined to repair these, to end these injustices, and who have put in a lot of hard work trying to do that, and sometimes been victorious and moved us forward.
No, for sure. And I think even right now, like there is the Bangladesh Accord, which is like one of the biggest pieces of like, it's a contract between brands and workers. It's a huge, huge thing for making the factory safe in the areas that have notoriously been the least safe for workers. And that comes from worker organizations. Like that's where this change is happening from. And so I think kind of the point that I was trying to highlight is that like, as people who are buying into the fashion industry, because we are, that's like, we're all wearing clothes, we're all buying into it in some way or another. We have a responsibility to be aware of this, but also what's almost more important is to be amplifying these worker voices and worker movements, because that's how this is going to change. They're the unions are the ones that are signing the contracts. They're the ones that are coming up with and telling us what needs to be changed in different areas. And so I just kind of wanted that to be kind of like top of mind in every sort of piece of this.
No, it comes across. I mentioned that there are deep problems that you discuss in the two sides of it. First in the production side, and then second in the kind of marketing side. And there also seems to be, tell me if this is the wrong impression, but there seems to be some movement on some of the worst aspects in the marketing side. I mean, a greater understanding of the kind of horrible, fat phobia that has always been there in fashion marketing, this sense that, this really ugly, again, when I was watching the September issue, Anna Wintour takes they take a picture at one point involving the cameraman from the film, and she's like, can we Photoshop out his stomach? Can we just cut that out? Like, it's clear that she's like viscerally revolted by the existence of his stomach. I feel like there's a bit more awareness now of the terrible psychological effect of the beauty standards.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that is something just generally with fashion and beauty that has changed quite a bit, not entirely for sure. Like it's still certainly a huge piece of what needs to change. But like you said, I think there is a general awareness of the social impact that fashion and beauty have on everyone, on the world. Like, these issues in the marketing with all just like the complete lack of inclusion of anybody other than just a very thin white woman. The awareness of that being a problem is a shift for sure from 10 years ago. Has it changed entirely? Of course not. But it is all related to the way that we, dehumanize people throughout the supply chain, because they're not the rich person that is buying into the best clothing, right? Like the fashion industry has a tendency to pay attention to one type of person with one type of bank account and ignore all of the rest. And so I think they are 100% linked in that way. Sorry, what was your other question? I apologize. I got lost in your thought.
Well, I was just talking about the slight crack in the consensus around the beauty standards and the the terrible effect that has on young people and young women especially.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's actually interesting, and I kind of talk about it a little bit in the book, is that hole in the market that was left by the high-end luxury part of the industry was picked up by fast fashion. These fast fashion brands were able to start making more inclusive sizing. They were being more inclusive on the marketing side for sure. And so in a way, it's such a detriment to the changes because they were able to just pick up right where the spot that the big brands were not.
Yeah, no, as I mentioned American Apparel earlier, they're like, oh, well, we have no sweatshops, but we also have a terrible internal culture.
Yeah.
It's like with the fast fashion, as you point out, some of it's actually, better on the size stuff and then worse on the sustainability stuff. So there's these terrible trade-offs where everything's problematic in some way.
Yeah, of course.
And one of the things you do in this book is that you go through the many different kinds of sins in the industry. You talk about, the exploitation of immigrants. You talk about, I just want to, we've gone through a lot of those sins. I want to go back to, at the beginning of your book, you talk about your kind of how the scales fell from your eyes, so to speak, or how you went from someone who kind of uncritically consumed to someone who was critical.
Yeah.
Could you recapture for us a little bit of how your own view of the industry came to change through being exposed to it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, it was one of those things where when you go into being a fashion editor, like we kind of talked about before, right? It's about being deciding which clothes people should buy. And which clothes are cool, which clothes are in, which are out, kind of reading trends and talking about the greatest brands. And so that's kind of how I was operating because that was the job. And so as I came to Teen Vogue and was writing, a little bit more about the cultural impact of clothing and the ways that our clothes kind of tell stories and they tell our history, I, of course, was digging into the sustainability side as that conversation was bubbling up a little bit more about 10 years ago. And there was a brand that I had written about very uncritically and just announcing that they had a new collection. And then about, an hour later, there was a story about they were being accused of using sweatshop labor in Sri Lanka. And I had this realization that I had written this story for an audience of people under 25. And I kind of put the position that I was put in was to give a stamp of approval saying, this is cool. You should buy it. Mm-hmm. It's awesome. And for me, realizing that if I'm writing these stories uncritically, I am doing a disservice to myself. I'm doing a disservice to the reader. And I'm certainly doing a disservice to the people that are working and making these clothes that I'm saying are okay. And so it was I recognize it as an aha moment, but it's something I knew it was just so in my face in that moment. And then from then on, it was one of those things where I was like, I have to either change jobs or figure out a way to push back. And I wanted to be part of that adjustment and that shift in the way that we're kind of looking at shopping a little more critically.
Let me ask you, obviously you've talked about how it is worker movements that achieve the kind of change that is necessary in terms of adjusting power in the industry. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we don't believe that purely changing consumption habits brings about the change that we wish to see in the world. Mm-hmm. But as consumers who have to make decisions, what do you think people ought to do in order to make at least the most ethical choices possible, given the range of choices we can currently make?
Sure. Yeah. It sounds so simple, but buying secondhand, it's just significantly better than buying new clothing. Extending the life cycle of the clothes that you have. Don't put your clothes in a charity bin. Certainly don't put your clothes in the trash, but fix them, send them to people, trade with people. It's this sort of community aspect of clothing that we have lost so much in just swapping and getting people to fix and buying something from your friend. who, knit a sweater, or the local shop down the street who makes like really high quality clothes, buying things you're going to wear, thinking about what you're buying a little bit more instead of just clicking something because you saw an advertisement and it looks really cute. Like, really think about how that was going to work into your life. Like, I'm sure you wear blazers a lot, right? Like, so when you're buying a blazer, you are going to say, okay, well, this is actually going to fit into my wardrobe for a while. But like, maybe the one that you kind of just saw on social media that where you were like, ooh, that's cool, but maybe not me. Don't do that impulse buy. To me, that's a pretty significant change for a lot of people. It is for me sometimes. I also have the impulse to buy things that I just see online randomly. And so I think that is a small habit that can make a pretty huge impact if a lot of people did it.
What about expensive versus cheap clothes? Sometimes we see like people like, if like AOC has like a really expensive jacket on, people will be like, a socialist in an expensive jacket. But also, like, one of the things that you've hinted at here is that like, if our clothes are going to be made ethically, they're probably also going to be more expensive, and that maybe cheap clothes could be, less ethical than expensive clothes. Is it bad? I mean, obviously people buy the clothes they can afford.
Sure.
But
yeah, no, I'm certainly, I'm not in the business of shaming people for buying clothes they can afford, but I do think that the reality is, if a piece of clothing is that cheap, it was most likely made by somebody that was not paid a livable wage. And so I think that having that understanding when we're talking about, if someone is going to buy an expensive piece of clothing and keep it in their wardrobe, that is probably the better way to shop. The caveat is, just because something expensive does not mean that it was made ethically.
Right.
So I think that there's certainly a balance, and like, there are brands that you can look into that are very transparent about their supply chain, that those are probably the ones to go for. Just because it's a luxury brand does not mean that it was made well. So I think that is sort of the nuance in that conversation. But I think like, buying better clothes is ethical, and you can get things secondhand. Might take a little digging, but
are there ways to know? I mean, is there transparency at all about the labor conditions and wages that various brands, ultimately pay?
Yeah, it's certainly complicated because yes and no, right? So there are some brands that you can be transparent about your supply chain and still not have it be best factories, right? So there are certain things like, did these brands sign on to something like the Bangladesh Accord, which guarantees that they have fire and health and safety checks happening? Do they have, not every certification is equal, but there are certain certifications that you can look for that are going to make it at least marginally better, or a better guarantee that someone has at least done a little bit of due diligence. And also, like, that applies to manufacturing everywhere, right? Like, even in the United States, which, I have a chapter about that. Like, there is some pretty horrific manufacturing practices in the US. So not going based off of where something is made, going based off of like how they are laying out how their clothes are made.
Yeah. You have a chapter titled "Made in America," and I assume there's a little bit of irony in that. We all say, yes, good, made in America, not made in Bangladesh. So clearly made by like well-paid union American workers.
Right.
Maybe it's made by exploited, undocumented people.
Yeah. No, and that's, like, there was a huge worker movement in California to address that very issue.
Yeah. So my final question for you would be kind of, where do we go next? What are the most promising upcoming possible developments that could fix some of the sins that you lay out in Worn Out?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of policy conversations happening in a way that is just like completely unprecedented. There is, the EU has some change to policies that will kind of change like what can be in clothing and how much clothing can be manufactured. In France, there is a law about the amount of clothing that has to sell, which is impacting imports and exports and costing money to these brands. In the US, there is a new law in California about, it's anti-wage theft law, making it so it's illegal to pay a garment worker per item. And then there is a bill in the Senate to make that law nationwide. So I think that if it's going to cost the brands money to act poorly, that is going to be the biggest change. And so just finding ways for it to cost them money to behave badly is the most promising. And I think people are doing it in new and interesting ways. The green guides, the comments just closed on that. And I think that could have a big impact on the fashion industry, depending what ends up going in them. And yeah, and then just people being more aware. Obviously, it's going to take a humongous change in consumption, but also just from a public perspective, the more that these brands are getting called out, the more they don't like it. And so, and so I think that's a big shift. And as that continues to grow, to me, I'm hopeful that could be part of the solution.
Yeah, consumers do have some power because ultimately they need your money.
Yeah.
So if you make it clear you won't give it to them, if they're obviously unethical, that can bring some pressure to bear. And this book is a good starting point for those of us who want to understand where it starts, where it goes, where it ends, the clothes that we wear, to really get a sense of the map of the industry, to really understand what the problems are and how we can fix them. The book is Worn Out: How Our Clothes Cover Up Fashion's Sins, available from the New Press. Alyssa Hardy, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me. Great conversation.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.